Hello. In this episode of ODI Bites, I'll be speaking with researcher and development practitioner Ika Fernandez. Ika's work cuts across many disciplines, including spatial planning, urban violence, governance reform. Ika's also the co-author of a new study for the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI, focusing on inclusion and exclusion in displacement and peace-building responses in Mindanao in the Philippines. So this case study has informed a cross-context research project at HPG on inclusion and exclusion. We've defined inclusion for this project as the ability to reach people most affected by a crisis with the assistance and protection they need, while also ensuring the opportunity for those people to participate in a response. Ika, welcome. Why do you think Mindanao is a compelling case study to interrogate these kind of issues, and how are concepts like inclusion understood in the Mindanao context?
Okay. Hi, John. Great question. Well, Mindanao in southern Philippines is one of the world's living laboratories for dealing with very protracted and cyclical crises, combining both armed conflict and environmental hazards. So currently, around 300,000 people are internally displaced across the island, but that changes. During spikes in the conflict, as in 2000 2008, up to 1 million people were displaced from their homes, with tens of thousands of people affected in stops and starts by smaller events in between. So this case study focuses on the Muslim majority called the Bangsamoro region. No, it's a formal autonomous region, the only one in the Philippines, in fact. And itself, it is inclusion policy, acknowledging the rights of a Muslim minority in a country that's 95% Catholic. So the Bangsamoro's formal name, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, the BARM, is a mouthful. So we often call it as BARM, BARMM, but in the past it was also called the ARMM prior to 2019. Okay, so the BARM in itself is very diverse, and across the region you have up to 6 to 10 languages spoken. Across these multiple languages, the closest translations of inclusion as a word focus on more universal forms of inclusion, meaning that you have to include or cover everybody. And very few of these languages have direct words for exclusion. So although people will accept that you have to prioritize when resources are scarce after a crisis, most of these communities will mean that to be really inclusive, you have to ensure that everybody, even those who are less vulnerable, will eventually get something. And so many practitioners and locals see the English word inclusion as intrinsically exclusive because in itself, it means that somebody, whether from the global north or locally, have decided that some people have to be included and others are predefined as excluded. So those kinds of complex conversations frame the tension between international humanitarian programming and how things happen on the ground.
Yung kita na silang ganun pintalo ka po konsulta. Adi na to na apya sulupan sa mga tawan to pagkanisita no na konsulta na gabo. Taman sa matulog ka, so tinto pagkanisisita. Kaya may pintalo inclusion na blanco po ng kalangan. Masukwanan na mabrodo po ng kalangan sa sa timan na galabukan. Na pinakamasdadan manasukwana manis inclusion na pintalo niya kapukonsulta. Kagina siya tanong mabili, kataliman ng mga tao sa kanong mga tito-tito programa tanong para sa kanilang serbisyo tanong o pamaning kalangon ng mga tao sa ground na ikonsulta tanong. Kagutan ng katawan tito-tito kanilang galilinyan.
Okay, so as we saw in the video there, inclusion in itself is a product of politics and power dynamics. We have to also remember that the BARM has been subject and created by multiple peace agreements. We had one in 1976, another in 1996. The latest ones were in 2012 and 2014. And so you have multiple programs and waves of post-crisis reconstruction, and many of the humanitarian aid institutions themselves in the BARM were created by peace agreements. So as a result, you have very representation-based concepts of inclusion as power sharing. And this means that there is a outsized focus in maintaining social cohesion and smooth interpersonal relations, even at the cost of exclusion, stifling of dissent, and further marginalization.
Thanks very much. So, what does all of that mean in practice for those affected by crises and receiving assistance? So, how do those ideas of inclusion really kind of manifest themselves in humanitarian responses, do you think?
Okay, quite a few implications. First of all, to navigate a very thick environment, a lot of the programs depend on the role of brokers, facilitators. These are different third party intermediaries, community leaders who take the role of bridging between source of aid and affected populations. No, and oftentimes they themselves are IDPs. So they do often spell the difference between success and non-success, but there are also issues of participation and, of course, elite capture. And so this also ties into a broader environment of sometimes unequal power relations, something which one of our respondents called as sultanic syndrome, where exclusion is already a fact of life given a very rigid social structure. And so sometimes this also justifies, even if the autonomy of the region is leading towards more local leadership, this also creates a role for purportedly external, more objective actors to ensure accountability. So there are a lot of tensions here because, for example, in gender efforts, women are often underrepresented in leadership positions, and this is something doubly an issue for those who are queer, LGBTQI, and given the high diversity of in the region, there are complaints regarding the island provinces getting less than the mainland provinces, and even the non-Muslim indigenous peoples within the Muslim-dominated BARM, see themselves as minorities within a minority. So, given this, I know there's a lot of self-reflection required, and that doubly so for the humanitarian sector because many of our respondents who themselves have worked across the sector say that they perceive exclusion to be often driven by the projects themselves. For example, humanitarian aid networks serving pre-selected target segments of populations. That becomes a problem when you are just following your own programming predetermined in the Western capital, irrespective of need. And so people are saying that, yes, you consult us, but the consultation's only a rubber stamp. Why come to us? Why ask us when you already know what you want to give us in the first place? And there's also different dynamics, such as the outsized focus of donors and INGOs on the immediate surge phase, when in fact two of the major urban conflicts in Mindanao, Zamboanga, which happened in 2015, and Marawi in 2017, many of their populations have not been able to go home 5 to 8 years after the fact. And so when your funding is only focused on life-saving, relief requirements without, actually dealing with the fundamental issues of return, then we have a problem here. And that's coupled with concerns regarding limited mandates, donor fatigue. And so being able to shift the dynamic, being able to make sure that the accountability is not to the donors but to the IDPs themselves. I think that's part of the conversation.
Ng programa ng organisasyon na po ito ay upang may lahat po yung karapatan po ng mga IDPs. Dapat po nating malaman o nakatukawan na ang current situation po, sinasabi po nila na IDPs is the center of this issue. Pero ang katotohanan, kinakaligtaan po mismo ng gobyerno yung responsibilidad niya sa mamamayan. Lingid po sa kaalaman ng lahat na bilang IDP, dapat po maging ma-involve po kami sa mga usapin, maging inclusive po yung usapin regarding po sa mga pagpaplano ng rehabilitation, pagpaplano ng pag-improve po sa sa MAAG. At the same time po, sana naman po is maging maganda po yung mga ibibigay po nila na kung saan po kumbaga magiging satisfied po yung bawat pamilya po doon sa ibibigay sana ng gobyerno para sa amin. Kasi po bilang po isang IDPs, mahirap po talaga yung mamuhay ka sa loob ng transitional shelters na hindi alam kahit nga po yung mga basic na pangangailangan kaya po ng mga tubig, ng medical assessment, parang kulang po, parang hindi po safe po yung tinutuloy namin mga shelters.
So, dagdagan ko lang yung sinabi ni Ramadan. As an prolonged IDP, it was parang neglected kami at all cost. Kasi po, as an IDP, we demand po sa lahat ng basic needs namin, katulad ng access to health, access to education, access to psychological support or the emotional support also. So yun po yung sinasabi namin na dapat po talaga ang gobyerno, we are being involved sa mga usapin. Kailangan po may people's participation. Kung ano man yung mga in-implement nila ng mga programs, project, kung ano yung gagawin nilang rules and regulations. Kasi para aware din po kami sa mga nangyayari sa kanila sa taas. Kasi kami po ang victim, not them. So we demand for justice, truth, and accountability. At gusto din namin makabalik ng safe and dignified return. Bakit dignified return? Siyempre, uuwi kami na mayroong tubig, mayroong ilaw, at maayos na paninirahan.
Does the example of the BARM suggest that more locally run and led humanitarian responses are more inclusive?
Well, in theory, yes. No, the BARM is, in theory now has more fiscal and political autonomy, but it's not always the case. And we saw that in the earlier clip from which featured 2 IDPs from Marawi City, and we'll need to go beyond just representation into the nuts and bolts of mainstreaming, inclusion, and exclusion, particularly when BARM's autonomy is still subject to national decision making, which may or not be inclusive in itself. So moving forward, we need to operationalize these intentions of inclusion and exclusion, from managing the systems for capturing data to now going towards, more universal and multi-year programming to ensure that when we say that we will help IDPs return to their homes after a crisis, we don't just leave after the first 6 months to a year once the funding dries up. And that requires a major shift in how we configure these projects, in terms of how we design, finance, and implement and monitor humanitarian aid programs. Ultimately, it goes back to being able to reckon with certain deep-seated biases, which we have, whether in the international humanitarian aid sector or locally, because whether we like it or not, people are still displaced, people are not able to go home, and ultimately, that goes to why people are still falling through the cracks.